Hi, welcome to Virtual CB1A. This is Miss Rena, and for today's video discussion, we're going to continue on parent functions and we're going to focus on trigonometric functions. So if you still remember, we have 6 trigonometric functions. These are the sine, the cosine, the tangent, and their reciprocals. Let's complete the spelling. We have the cosecant, the second function, and finally the cotangent function. Now, what are the parent functions for each of these trigonometric functions? So let's start with the sine. So the sine parent function is sine x, while for cosine, it is of course cosine x. For tangent, it is tangent x. For cosecant, we have cosecant x. For secant, we have secant x. And finally, for cotangent, we have cotangent x. So we are going to have a discussion for each of these trigonometric functions. Let's start with the sine function. So for the sine function, f of x is equal to sine x. What is going to be our graph? So again, let's go back to our Desmos graphing calculator and graph our sine function. Okay, now let's input our function. F of x is equal to sine x. And let's look at its graph. Oops. Alright. So here you go. This is the graph of our trigonometric function sine x. Now let's analyze our graph. So what will be the domain of our graph here? So let's go back to our board. So for the domain of sorry, naglalag siya. Oops. So for the domain of our function sine x, it will be from the negative infinity up to the positive infinity. So going back to our graph, if you will take notice, for the value of x, it will have a value from the negative infinity, such as x is a real number, and to the positive infinity. It will always have a value for the range. So all the values for x can be substituted. Now let's go to the range. For the range, you will see there some limits on the values for y. So what is going to be the highest point? This is periodic. Umuulit lang siya for certain values of x. Medyo nagahang ulit siya. So what is going to be the highest value of our graph? And what is going to be the lowest value? So if you will look at the graph, you will notice that the highest value is at 1, while the lowest value is at negative 1. So this is the highest value, and this is the lowest value, which is in positive 1 and negative 1. So let's write it here. The range is just from -1 and +1. And anything outside of this interval will not be included. Now, what is going to be the inverse? Ang dali ng inverse nito. All you have to do is to get the arcsine. We have the inverse of our parent function sine x is, of course, the arcsine x. Okay? Okay. Now, let's go to its restriction. Are there any restriction? So, there is none. All the values for x can be substituted. Now, let's analyze the graph again. Is it odd or even? So, look at the value or look at the graph. Is it symmetric about the y-axis? No. Is it symmetric about the origin? Yes. So, therefore, it is odd. Now, let's look at the general form. So, for the general form, that is f of x is equal to a sine b of x minus h plus k. Please take note of the general form of the different functions that we have discussed because after this, we're going to talk about transformations. So, we're going to insert constants a and b to our function and analyze how the function will behave. Okay? Now that we are done with the sine function, we're going to move forward to the cosine function. For this, I will only discuss sine, cosine, and tangent, and then you will have to self-study cosecant, secant, and cotangent. Okay? Oops, naglalag na naman siya. Okay, now for the cosine function, the parent function is cosine x. Now, what will the graph look like? Let's go back to the Desmos application and draw the graph for the cosine function. Okay, so now this is the graph of our cosine function. If you will take notice, it is almost similar with the sine function. It looks almost the same, but their intervals or their corresponding values for y is different. And also their symmetry is different. We already discussed this during your trigonometry course. So for our domain, it is similar with the domain of sine, which is from the negative infinity up to the positive infinity. But for the range, again, you have some restrictions. The lowest values and the highest value will be limited to -1 and 1. So the range will be from -1 to 1. Okay? Now, let's go to the inverse. Dali ulit ng inverse. So, for the inverse, that is the arcsine or arc cosine x. Now, let's go to the restriction. Do we have any restriction? Again, wala. Pwede mo i-substitute lahat. Now, look at the symmetry. Is it odd or even? So, earlier, saan nag-reflect si sine? So, nag-reflect siya about the origin dito. But this time, for the cosine, it is symmetric about the y-axis. That makes cosine even. So, this is even. Now, let's discuss the general form. What is the general form of the cosine function? We have f of x is equal to a cosine b x minus h plus k. Alright. And finally, let's look at the tangent function. So we have f of x is equal to tangent x. Interesting to kasi we have some restrictions kasi it is asymptotic on some points. So we have f of x ay f of x is equal to tangent x. What do we know? O, bakit ganyan yung graph niya? Balikan natin yung idea ng tangent. So, we know that tangent x is also equal to sine x over cosine x. So, kailan tayo nagkakaroon ng mga undefined values? If we have quotients. So, dito, if cosine x is equal to 0, then it is undefined. Okay? Alright. So, saan nagsisiro yung cosine natin? Balik natin dito yung graph ni cosine. So, yeah. We have cosine x. Ayan. Saan siya nagsi-zero? So, it is 0 at 0. It is 0 at this point. And this point is negative pi over 2. It is also 0 at this point. It is pi over 2. How about this point? It is 3 pi over 2. How about this point? It is 5 pi over 2. So, ano ba yung values ni cosine where it will be equal to 0? So, the value of the cosine where it will be equal to 0 is pi over 2. Just wait a moment. Cosine x is equal to 0 at x is equal to pi over 2 plus minus n pi. Ayan. So, for the domain, you are going to have the negative infinity up to the positive infinity with the condition that x shouldn't be equal to pi over 2 plus minus n pi. Kasi dun siya mag-0. So, all values in the set of x can be included except for those values that will fall on pi over 2 plus minus n pi. Now, for the range. Meron ba tayong limitation sa range? Wala. So, it is from the negative infinity up to the positive infinity. Lahat matatouch niya. What about the inverse? Again, ito yung pinakamadali. We have the inverse of the tangent function is, of course, the arctangent function. X. Now, let's look at the restriction. Sabi nga natin kanina, may except tayo dito, di ba? So, ito rin yung restriction natin. So, x should not be equal to any value that will fall on pi over 2 plus n pi. And also, pi over 2 minus n pi. Next, we have to look at the graph again and see whether it is odd or even. So, is it symmetric about the origin? If it is going to be odd. Is it symmetric about the y-axis? If it is going to be even. So, tinanggal ko ulit si cosine, and as you will notice, it is symmetric about the origin. That makes it an odd function. And finally, let's talk about the general form. What is going to be the general form of this equation? We have f of x is equal to a tangent b of x minus h plus k. Alright? So that will be it for our discussion on trigonometric functions. As I've said, you already have the module, so you will be studying cosecant functions, secant functions, and cotangent functions by yourselves. Okay? So thank you very much for staying with me for about 15 minutes. And for the next video lecture, we're going to talk about other important functions that you are going to encounter on your subject. Those are the absolute value functions. Gamit na gamit din natin siya. And inverse function, parabola, circle, ellipse, and hyperbola. Okay? So thank you and have a good day. Bye!